Junction, Kennedy, 43 minutes. O'Hare to downtown, 24 from Montrose, 22 in the Express. Eisenhower, an hour, 390 to downtown, 42 minutes from Manheim. Stevenson, 55 minutes, 355 to Lakeshore Drive. Northbound Tri-State delays are 87th to 47th. Reagan Tollway to Lawrence. Reagan Tollway's gummed up. Eola to 53. I'm Jim Alamonte on AM 560, The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next. Your official Chicagoland weather forecast from the 1-hour heating and air conditioning weather center. Partly sunny and cold today. High 33, 19 at O'Hare. Next news at 9. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by the IRS Radio Hour with Stephen Leahy. Every Sunday afternoon at 5 on AM 560, The Answer.
Let freedom ring this afternoon at 2 with Sean Hannity on AM 560, The Answer.
Dan and Amy, and this is instructive coming from our college campuses, a place I want to go. From the College Fix, a Romanian-born academic says he recently left his tenured position at Columbia because the Ivy League school is, quote, on its way toward full-blown communism. Professor Andrei Serbin, an award-winning director, complained about the increasing social justice demands he faced in the theater department in the interview he provided to a Romanian television station. A prominent example he gave, pressure to admit a transgender applicant who had auditioned as Juliet for a performance of Romeo and Juliet. Columbia still lists Serbin as an active professor, but he says he's out of there. His interview came after a faculty member retired. The remaining professors in his department, the theater department, were called into a meeting to discuss a replacement. At that meeting, the dean of the art school told them that there were too many white professors, too many heterosexual men. It would be best to hire a minority or a woman or a gay man. Serbin, who is the director of the hiring committee, says he was told it could not be someone like him because he is a man that has been married and he's a heterosexual man who has children. So obviously you can't have too many of those, otherwise you run into a problem in the theater, the world of theater. Over University of North Carolina at Greensboro, anti-free speech conference. The irony lost on them. Finding expression in contested public spaces. We talked earlier in the week and played a clip of a Weber State debate coach who argued that outer space doesn't necessarily exist. It's a fantasy of whiteness. Yeah. Right. That opinion is proof that outer space exists, or certainly blank space between some people's ears. It literally went on that discussion. If you haven't experienced something, then you can't confirm it exists. The belief is attached to this notion of whiteness. And so the student arguing with him said, so I've been to Paris, so I can't say that Paris existed. I wasn't around for slavery. I've never witnessed slavery in my life, so I can't say slavery didn't happen. And then the response is, well, that's like slavery, post-traumatic slavery disorder if you deny slavery exists. Well, I'm not denying slavery exists. I'm just saying if I don't experience something, then I can't understand that it was true based on historical information about the event or the person or the incident. Remarkable times, troubling times. And, I mean, it goes to the willful blindness in so many areas of life, including the ones we've talked about this week in the wake of the media's non-coverage of Weinstein, and now we learn Epstein at ABC News, and the non-coverage of sexual abuse stories, local school districts around the country, including one woman trying to have the laws changed in Rhode Island and Massachusetts regarding well, frankly,
age of consent,
regarding sexual predators who are teachers vis-a-vis their students. it's remarkable what's going on culturally, which is why I thought our next guest would be a good person to comment on this. He wrote a book about it in part. He's the author of Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. He's the associate editor for Commentary Magazine and an MSNBC, NBC News contributor. Noah Rothman, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
What about the drip of these examples, particularly from college campuses? A Romanian American immigrant professor who left Columbia, as you just heard me describing, the anti-free speech conference at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Is there enough attention being paid and resources being devoted, battle being joined, when it comes to the unmaking of America in these respects?
No, not at all. These institutions are complicit in the phenomena. What you were describing earlier in the segment sort of reminded me of a story when I was promoting the book. So I'd been invited to lecture at a reasonably prestigious law school in New York City, speaking with a class of law students and describing some of the country's founding documents. And among one of the students' very agitated objections to those documents was the preamble to the Constitution, in which she insisted that by virtue of the fact that the founders repeatedly referred to men in that document and man and mankind, that it was an illegitimate document because it had erased the female gender from the spectrum of political activity. And I tried to explain to her that she was simply wrong, that she had a misconception of how the founders understood the word man and mankind to refer to all of humanity. And seems like a pretty open shut case to me, but she was very adamant about her assertion that this was just ignorance and prejudice on the part of the founders, and it couldn't be her misconception. And it struck me that there just weren't a lot of people in her life that respected her enough to tell her she was wrong. And that is an act of respect, that she was simply being coddled and guided and handheld through her career all the way up to the point at which I encountered her, which was on her way to receiving her JD. And that strikes me as a real failure of not just the education system, but society generally, that this individual's perceptions, as wrong as they were nurtured and nursed for so long that she had become resistant to even the notion that she had a misconception here, even though it's quite obvious that she simply was unfamiliar with the primary documents of the founding. And that's essentially the problem that we face here, is that there is a level of ignorance which has been nurtured and justified as a perfectly valid outlook, when it is anything but. And there's not a lot of people around these young people in particular, but it's not just young people. We shouldn't just scapegoat the upcoming generation. I mean, this is a much broader phenomenon, but it is generally a broader malady involving the perception that all opinions are valid, and every opinion and every emotion has a foundation to it that needs to be accepted or at least understood, and that's just simply not true.
And we have more examples of that this week, coming from the adults. To your point, it's not a millennial or a Gen Z problem specific It's not limited to those populations. A bunch of scientists are restating the Paul Ehrlich population bomb argument, 21st century style, to beat the climate crisis, which is you have to take as an article of faith. You can't challenge the premise. The Earth needs fewer people.
Yeah, there is nothing more discredited than the idea that population increases overstress local ecologies and local economies. That idea was popular. Paul Ehrlich was among the popularizers of this idea that he's not alone. And it has simply made a lot of predictions over the decades, none of which have come to pass, and yet he retains his position. And there is nothing, I think, in the post-war world, ideational orientations in the post-war world that has justified the kind of eugenics and disastrous policy of the sort that we've seen in World War II, like population control. And the United States was an executor of those policies. American foreign policy and American domestic policy was directed towards providing resources to organizations that engaged in the complicit, if not explicit, implicit rather, if not explicit, sterilization of women, for example, in Puerto Rico. Young women who were compelled to engage in sterilization as a result of the presumption of population control being a desirous outcome. And none of these women were given the proper understanding of what they were engaged in. It was a very duplicitous process. And the United States was absolutely involved in that. Similarly, in sub-Saharan Africa, we've been engaged in these sort of processes under the assumption, the false belief, that the amount of people contribute to ecological disaster and economic disaster, and there's just simply no evidence to suggest that. Quite the opposite. In fact, as population grows, humanity, mankind, is the greatest resource, the greatest economic resource we have, and the more people that we've had, and the incredible growth of population on this planet in the last 30 years has contributed to an increase in human living standards and
Noah, how long has that been
viability.
going on? How long has that been going on in Puerto Rico?
That was in the mid 60s, I believe, like late 50s, 60s. So it was a short-lived policy, but I have a piece on this in Commentary Magazine, actually, about the Malthusianism of this ideology. And if you really examine the outcomes that this ideology resulted in, they're really horrible, really quite tragic, and based on absolutely fraudulent science.
Well, and again, this piece, which was amplified by AOC, who tweeted in support of it, statement that was made in the Bioscience Journal. We declare, with more than 11,000 scientists signatories from around the world, clearly and unequivocally, the planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. I wonder how many of those 11,000 are in science departments at universities around the world. They go one step further, though. They say this, and talk about a statement that is chock full of dire implications. On population, quote, it must be stabilized and ideally gradually reduced within a framework that ensures social integrity.
Yeah, I don't even know what that means. It's pretty ominous. Yeah, so just, touching back to some of this ideology, I mean, a lot of the title of Ehrlich's book originally, The Population Bomb, was lifted from a 1954 pamphlet issued by General William Draper on the Population Crisis Committee. These are all American inventions. And it directly led to a program, according to the work of Angela Frank, whose 2005 book on Margaret Sanger demonstrated that American policy had legitimized the sterilization of childbearing Native American women in 1977, as we discussed, the quote-unquote voluntary effort to liberate childbearing women of Puerto Rico from the burden of having to carry children in 1965. Almost a third of women of childbearing age underwent voluntary sterilization, that it wasn't necessarily voluntary. They were really coerced into this process. And then USAID, which was subject to a lot of American funds. 1974 Security Council memorandum compelled some incentives to create a program in USAID that dispatched population controllers to sub-Saharan Africa and contributed to the efforts to sterilize young women there. And it was all in service to an idea postulated by people like Paul Ehrlich, who said at times like that in 1980, for example, American lifespan would decline to just the age of 42, that most people would die, most people who are born will have died by 1980. In 1969, he wrote this, quote, the death rate will increase at least 100 to 200 million people per year due to starvation in the next 10 years. He wrote that in 1970, I believe. Clearly, that didn't occur. Between 1980 and 1989, most of millions would be subject to what he called the Great Die-Off. And all of this didn't occur, but nevertheless, Paul Ehrlich maintains his position as a professor, I believe, at Stanford. I'm not sure where. It's a prestigious institution. And his ideas remain subject to discreditation only by people who are familiar with them, it seems. Just about everybody else seems to take it as gospel, which is demonstrative, I think, of what Malthusianism really is, which is a faith. I mean, it is not falsifiable.
Well, right, and it just the idea I mean, the idea essentially comes down to just work the internal logic of it. We're going to save humanity by eliminating the humans. Okay. All right. That's the plan. Noah Rothman, associate editor for Commentary Magazine, MSNBC, NBC News contributor. The book, Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. Noah, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You've made the switch, and it feels so good. You've switched to Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
If you're self-employed and purchase your own health insurance, I have some good news. From now until December 15th, you cannot be denied coverage based on a pre-existing condition, and depending on your income, you may find a more affordable plan. And this year, thanks to President Trump, if you're healthy and your income is too high to qualify for a subsidy, there is a new and competitive non-Obamacare marketplace where premiums are much lower and the PPO networks include access to our teaching hospitals in Chicago. Employers who provide small group coverage also have new options, and so do seniors looking for Medicare supplement coverage. Call me. I can help.
If you're tired of calling a bureaucrat at an 800 number to help you navigate Obamacare, then you need a local expert on your side. Your own health insurance mentor. C. Stephen Tucker from healthinsurancementors.com is someone I know and trust. He's a 20-year licensed broker who's been educating our listeners for 7 years. Steve, how can our listeners get in touch with you?
Thanks, Dan. They can visit healthinsurancementors.com or call me directly at 630-674-1551.
Balance of Nature. Changing the world, one life at a time.
I've been taking it for 5 years, and I have not been sick once. I mean, I tell people all the